This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. What just happened did not happen on television. It did not trend. It did not come with a chyron or a countdown clock. And yet, it may quietly change how law works, how money moves, and how power decides when rules still apply. While attention was pulled towards spectacle, something else moved underneath it. Something procedural. Something legal. Something that almost no one is explaining clearly. A switch was flipped, not to protect people, not to defend borders, but to place certain money beyond reach, beyond courts, beyond creditors. Beyond ordinary enforcement, that kind of move is rare. It is technical, and it only happens when something much larger is being prepared. If you think this has nothing to do with you, stay with me. And that pressure does not stay theoretical for long. This is where it reaches you. Not as policy, as effect. You feel it when prices move before explanations arrive. When volatility shows up without a headline big enough to justify it, you feel it when markets react to certainty for some and uncertainty for everyone else. Because when the system protects capital first, risk does not vanish. It travels, it shows up in pensions, in funds you didn't choose directly, in costs that rise quietly while accountability remains frozen. You are told this is stability, that this prevents chaos, but real stability does not require exemptions. It does not require pausing the law. What you are watching is insulation, and insulation always has an outside. If this analysis feels uncomfortable, that's not accidental. It's because this part is rarely named ideology. It is access to capital, access to enforcement, access to protection when contracts collide with strategy. This is why moments like this never arrive alone. They arrive with lawyers, with frameworks, with quiet assurances made behind closed doors. The public story is always about values. The private work is about insulation. And once a system learns it can suspend itself without consequence, it remembers that option. That memory changes behavior everywhere, which brings us to the part almost everyone missed. The shift that made this moment possible at all. There was a time when this kind of move would have caused shock. Hearings, emergency sessions, days of sustained attention. That time passed quietly. What changed was not a single law. It was expectation. Slowly, almost invisibly, the idea settled in that emergencies are permanent, that extraordinary powers are normal, that suspension is just another tool before an exception required consensus. Now it requires urgency. And urgency is easy to manufacture, so the baseline shifted. Courts learned their limits. Markets learned to wait. Institutions learned when to look away. Nothing collapsed. Nothing exploded, which is why it worked. The most dangerous changes never announce themselves. They arrive as procedure, as continuity, as temporary measures that never fully expire. Over time, the system stopped asking, should this be allowed? And started asking, is this permitted under emergency? That difference matters. Because once slow change hardens, reversal becomes unthinkable. Not illegal, unthinkable. And when that threshold is crossed, the next shock doesn't feel radical. It feels inevitable, which is exactly why the first visible rupture caught so few people prepared. Then the quiet broke. Not with an announcement, with a sequence. First, a dramatic action everyone could see. Image, movement, authority made visible. That's where attention went. That's what dominated conversation. But almost immediately within the same window, something else happened. Something smaller, something procedural. Paper moved faster than people realized. Decisions were made before questions formed. A legal barrier dropped into place. Not debated, not litigated, activated. It did one specific thing. It froze access. It told courts to stand down. It told creditors to wait, not forever, just long enough. That timing matters. because freezes like this are not defensive. They are preparatory. They do not solve a crisis. They clear space. And once space is cleared, something always moves in. If this were about punishment, claims would be enforced. If this were about justice, cases would proceed. Instead, everything paused at once. That is not hesitation. That is alignment. And alignment only happens when the next step is already decided, which means what looks like an endpoint isn't. Here is where the system reveals itself, because what looks like protection is actually filtration. Not everyone is being shielded. Only certain interests pass through intact. The mechanism is simple. When claims exist, someone must absorb the loss. When courts are blocked, someone is prioritized. The damage does not disappear. It is displaced. Legal judgments become inconvenient. Arbitration awards become negotiable. Obligations become flexible if they interfere with what comes next. Who benefits is never announced. You can see it by who gains certainty. Certainty is everything. Capital does not move into chaos. It moves into environments where risk has been quietly socialized. Losses are frozen. Timelines are stretched. Past disputes are suspended in the name of future stability. And the cost of that suspension is not paid by those entering. It is absorbed by those waiting. This is how consolidation works. Not with force. With sequencing. First, neutralize friction. Then, invite participation. By the time contracts appear, the field has already been cleared. Options narrowed. Alternatives removed, which is why the next development never arrives as a surprise to insiders. Only to everyone else. And the pace is about to accelerate. Now it speeds up. Not in public, on paper. Meetings happen quickly. Statements are brief. Numbers appear without context. Large ones. Frameworks are announced before scrutiny catches up. Language is careful, optimistic, forward-looking, and suddenly, waiting becomes pressure. Those with unresolved claims are told to be patient. Those without access are told to adjust. Those watching are told this is necessary. Nothing is explained fully, because it doesn't need to be. Momentum does the work. Once capital senses protection, it moves. Once it moves, it demands continuity. Once continuity is demanded, reversal becomes destabilizing. So options narrow again. This is how acceleration hides, not as chaos, as inevitability. At this point, even questioning the process sounds disruptive, risky, out of step, which is exactly when the consequences stop being abstract, because what has been insulated at the top begins to press downward, and that pressure does not stay theoretical for long. This is where it reaches you. Not as policy, as effect. You feel it when prices move before explanations arrive. When volatility shows up without a headline big enough to justify it, you feel it when markets react to certainty for some and uncertainty for everyone else. Because when the system protects capital first, risk does not vanish. It travels, it shows up in pensions, in funds you didn't choose directly, in costs that rise quietly while accountability remains frozen. You are told this is stability, that this prevents chaos, but real stability does not require exemptions. It does not require pausing the law. What you are watching is insulation, and insulation always has an outside. If this analysis feels uncomfortable, that's not accidental. It's because this part is rarely named ideology. If you want to understand what's happening before it hits you, again, stay here. Pay attention, because what started as a contained maneuver is no longer contained. The effects don't stop at borders. They ripple outward. And the next wave is already forming. Once the ripple leaves its origin, it changes shape. What began as a local maneuver becomes a signal, not a message meant for the public. A message meant for other systems watching closely, because when rules bend in one place, they don't bend in isolation. They are studied, mapped, learned. Other governments notice which claims are enforced and which ones quietly disappear. Other markets notice which currencies are protected and which ones absorb the shock. And they adjust. Some hedge, some accelerate alternatives, some pull back from exposure they no longer trust to remain neutral. This is how fragmentation starts, not with confrontation. With caution, confidence erodes asymmetrically. Slow in public, fast in private, the world does not respond all at once. It recalibrates. And recalibration is dangerous because it happens before consensus, before new rules exist. So the system stretches, not breaking yet, just thinning, which means the future no longer depends on one decision. It depends on how many of these signals accumulate before something finally gives. And we are closer to that threshold than we are being told. From here, the system does not move in a straight line. It branches. There are three paths. The first is adjustment. The machinery holds. Agreements settle, production resumes. Stability is performed well enough to calm markets. The exception becomes precedent, and life moves on, slightly altered. The second is erosion. Trust thins. Legal certainty weakens at the edges. More actors hedge. More claims are delayed. The system still functions, but at higher cost, with more friction, more volatility baked in. Then there is rupture, not sudden, not cinematic. A point where too many exceptions exist at once. Where protection for some triggers withdrawal by others. Where confidence breaks faster than it can be restored. The system has survived moments like this before. It has also failed in moments like this before. The pattern does not tell us which path will win. It only tells us that once consolidation reaches this stage, the future accelerates whether anyone is ready or not. And the final outcome is rarely decided where the spotlight is. It's decided in the quiet space between protection and belief. Which brings us to the last thing you need to see. This does not end with clarity. It never does. What you are watching is not an event, but a permission structure being tested in real time. A system learning how far it can bend itself to protect what it values most. Nothing here requires you to panic, but none of it allows you to look away. Because once emergency becomes routine, the line between rule and exception dissolves. And when that happens, outcomes stop being guaranteed by law and start being determined by alignment. Who is protected? Who waits? Who absorbs the cost? The next phase will not announce itself. It will arrive as normalcy, as investment, as stability. If you want to understand what comes after that, how resource control, currency power, and legal authority lock together, you need to keep watching. This is not the end of the pattern. It is the moment it disappears into the background. And when systems disappear into the background, they do the most damage. Stay curious. Stay uncomfortable. The next layer is already moving.